When I was about 10 years old, a movie had come out called The Mighty Ducks. Hockey in Houston became a really big deal. Now, hockey typically is not a big deal in Houston because we don't have ice. It's really, really hot. But for whatever reason, that movie sparks this movement across the country where people, even in warm places, fall in love with hockey. My brother calls into a TV show that's doing this promotion. He gets kind of freaked out because he feels like he's too old for the promotion, so he hands me the phone, and I win an opportunity to go to a hockey game and take a shot. So I'm about 10 years old, I go to a hockey game, my family's there, crowd's there. I, along with about 7 other contestants, go down to the ice. I walk out there one by one, we get to take the puck and shoot at a goal that's probably 50 yards away. I don't know the ice terminology for that, but I'd never been on ice before, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I had never stepped on ice before. I'd never held a hockey stick before, but I felt supremely confident that this couldn't be that hard. I had, in fact, seen the movie Mighty Ducks. And so the kid in front of me, she was much smaller than I was. She steps up, she takes it, and she just glides it way out there. I mean, she gets close to the goal. I step up. I even egged on the crowd. I was that obnoxious 10-year-old. I turned to the crowd, kind of did one of these. Now it's Houston, so it's not like there was a huge crowd in the first place. But there was, in fact, a crowd. It was a professional hockey game. And I decided I was going to hit it just like you do if I was swinging a baseball bat, except I would be doing it on the ice. And so I take the stick and I rear back. That was a mistake, by the way. I rear back and I swing as hard as I can. The stick hits the ice about a foot before the puck. My back right leg slides out in front of me as I'm following through. I barely graze the top of the ice, or the puck, after hitting the ice. And so the puck goes about, I would say 20, maybe 25 inches, and I fall down flat on my back. Literally, I slid further than the puck did. I stood up. I kind of tried to dust the ice and now the water off of myself unsuccessfully. Have you ever had a moment in life where you desperately wanted a redo? I remember for the next night and the next week and the next month, I just kept going back to that moment thinking, if I could just have one more shot at it, I know I'd do it differently. I know I'd do it better. Have you ever had just feeling of utter disappointment? Maybe you've had a moment in life where you failed. Maybe it wasn't an event like that. Maybe it was just more of a general experience. Right now, is there a moment or an area of your life where if you could have the opportunity, you'd say, man, I want a redo with that. I wish I could do that one more time. Maybe it's a much bigger thing. Maybe you say, I wish I just had a redo with life. I don't like where I am. I don't like what things are going on, and if I could just change a few things, man, life would be better. I think all of us, if we could right now clearly know the will of God for our life, it would just make things so much easier. Oftentimes we feel like we're just kind of roaming around, but if we just had that burning bush experience like Moses and we knew exactly what we were supposed to do, then we wouldn't feel like we were blindly going about life. We started a series last week in the book of Colossians. We're going to pick up there. If you've got a Bible, open up to Colossians chapter 1. Paul's writing a letter to a church that he has never himself visited before. And in verse 9, where we're picking up, we hear the specificness of the prayer that he's praying for this church. This is what he says. He says, and so, from the day we heard, saying the moment that we heard about what the gospel was doing in the lives in your church, from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. So pause for a second, because here's what we think when we hear that prayer. We say, oh, I wish I could be filled with the knowledge of God's will for my life, thinking that word filled represents a destination. Thinking that word filled represents this one specific place that if I do everything right, here's where I end up. It's easy sometimes as Christians that we look at our heroes of the faith And we think, man, I wish I could be like that person. For many of us, it's Dr. Young. You look at his ministry, you look at what he's done and accomplished, you say, if I could just be like that, then I would be in God's will for my life. Then I would be doing something great with my life. But here's what's interesting. The Greek here of what's happening with that word fill, he's not talking about this specific destination. He's talking about this ongoing process. It's a divine passive. What that means is that the power, the implied power of what's accomplishing this work is God. It's not the individual. It's not them doing it. It's God that's doing it. That they might be filled with this knowledge and understanding of God's will for their life. And then the next verse, he tells us exactly what it is. Look in verse 10. So, why do we need to be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God? So Paul has two requests in his prayer: to know and to live. The first request of his prayer is this: he wants them to have full knowledge of the will of God. And then the second is to live a life that's worthy of the Lord. What does that mean? What does it mean for us to live a life that's worthy of the Lord? Well, he breaks it down right after that. The traits of a life that's pleasing to the Lord is very specific. He says that it's a life that is bearing fruit, and it's a life that is growing. Now, what's interesting about verse 9 and verse 10 is that they're very interconnected with each other. So verse 9 is really the root of our faith, that we be filled with a knowledge and understanding of God, our relationship with him. It's understanding the cross. The rest of Colossians, especially this chapter, it gets into the preeminence of Christ. He's setting the table to say that our faith is rooted in understanding what Jesus has done for you and I on the cross. But that in and of itself is not the end. That is so that we might bear fruit. Now, the bearing of fruit is impossible without the root. That we have to start with the relationship with God. But when we have that relationship with God, it should then lead to a fruitful life, a life that is growing in him. So it's kind of like this Christian funnel that exists, that it starts with a knowledge and an understanding of God. But when we have a knowledge and an understanding of God, when we truly glimpse how amazing and how awesome he is, it will lead us to pursue holiness. That if I know Jesus and I recognize what he's done for me, that I've been redeemed for him, that I was unworthy, it's not what I have done, but what he has done through me, that because of that knowledge in my life, it's going to cause me to pursue holiness. And as I pursue holiness and enter into that relationship with God, what that's going to breed is more knowledge and understanding, because as I pursue holiness in my life, I become more and more Christ-like. I continually learn more about God, and as I learn more about God, it's going to cause me to be what? To pursue more holiness. So my relationship with God is not stagnant. Instead, it's deepening. I'm growing deeper and deeper and deeper in that relationship. Why is that so hard? Sometimes we feel like we get stuck. We feel like we hit that wall and we're not sure what happens next. There was a fascinating study that was done by a guy. He was a college professor. He went all across the country doing something called the Marshmallow Challenge. His name was Tom Wujek. And so Tom Wujek, he did this hundreds and hundreds of times. What he would do is he would take 20 sticks of spaghetti, just like this. 20 sticks of spaghetti. He would get teams of 4 people. So they'd be a big room. He'd break them up into teams of 4. And he'd say, you've got 18 minutes. And the goal in that 18 minutes is to build a tower as tall as you can build it. You can only use the 20 pieces of spaghetti. You've got 1 yard of string. You got 1 yard of tape. And this was the important part, the marshmallow has to sit on top of whatever you build. And so they'd divide up into teams. He'd say, ready, go, and bam, they would just immediately start going as fast as they can, trying to build this structure. Now, he did it over and over and over again, enough to start getting kind of a baseline of how people performed. It was interesting. On average, a group would be able to build a tower that was 20 inches tall. Now, interestingly, those students that had just finished business school, so fresh MBA graduates, they would do this activity and they would perform below average, half as good as the average person. Lawyers, on the other hand, when they would do it, they were a little bit better than business school grads, but worse than average. Now, kindergartners, you think, what would it be if you took some kids that had just graduated from kindergarten and you gave them that same challenge? How successful would they be? And they were more successful than the adults by a lot. Over twice as successful as recent MBA graduates. Fortunately for us, architects and engineers, that's the one group that, yes, they in fact do better than kindergartners. If they didn't, we'd all be really, really worried right now. So you think, okay, well, surely CEOs, they've got to be the cream of the crop. They've got to be, and not as good as architects and not quite as good as kindergartners. And so he would do this over and over again, and he thought the pattern was fascinating to realize that kindergartners outperformed really smart adults consistently over and over again. And it really came down to four different things. Four different things that adults did poorly that kindergartners tended to naturally do well. The first was that kindergartners had zero preconceived ideas. They didn't in their mind have the tower built and this is what it's supposed to be or this is what it's supposed to look like. Whereas adults would go in and they'd say, okay, I know before we're even starting, I know what this is supposed to be. I know exactly how we're gonna build it the right way. So kindergartners would just start building. And they'd try different things. Sometimes their structures look wildly different than what you'd expect. The second thing is that they had zero fights for control. That almost immediately in the adult groups, they would start fighting with one another over who is gonna be the alpha, who's gonna be the person that was the boss, who's gonna be telling everybody else what to do. And so they'd kind of go back and forth, and they'd waste a lot of time right at the beginning. So instead of starting right away, they were discussing, they were talking, whereas kindergartners, the moment you said go, they were starting to build, they were starting to work, they were starting to figure it out. And then the biggest difference between the adults and the kids was that the kids constantly measured. That on average, the kids 5 different times would build up their structure and then take that marshmallow and put it on top of the structure and see if it worked. You see, what's deceptive about the marshmallow is that it looks so light. It's soft, it's fluffy. We've all had a marshmallow, you can pick it up. But when you're building with spaghetti sticks, it's a whole lot heavier than it looks. So time and time again, here's what would happen. The adults, they would build up this tower. They'd hear that the time is ticking down. They only had 1 minute left. And so they'd try and rush to the end, and then they'd all back up, and one person would just gently take that marshmallow and put it on top of their tower. And sometimes it would hold for a second, but oftentimes the weight of the marshmallow caused everything else to come crashing down. There's a lot that we can learn about life from kindergartners. The same 4 mistakes that those adults made in that contest are the same 4 mistakes that I make all the time in life. That it starts with us having these preconceived ideas, thinking this is what I know success looks like. This is the direction I know my life needs to go. If I'm going to be happy, this is what it's going to be. That instead of coming to God on our knees and saying, God, what's your will? You guide me. That often we come with preconceived ideas saying, God, this is what I want you to do for me. And it doesn't work that way. The second is that they fight. They fight for authority. How often in my own life am I struggling with God that in pride I'm trying to dictate to him what I want him to do for me, as opposed to humbly saying, God, hey, you're the boss. I'm just the worker. You tell me what to do and where to go, and I'll do it. That how often do we hesitate to start? When you look through the Bible, And you think of disappointment. You think of people who want a redo. Think of people that had failure. The Bible is filled with people that experienced dramatic disappointment. That you go back and you look at the life of Moses. That Moses had murdered an Egyptian. That he was in the desert. He was running away. That at that moment in his life, as he reflected back, can you just imagine what he thought? At that point in his life, he would have just completely labeled himself a failure. He would have said, like, I wish I could redo everything. But God took his brokenness and used Moses to become one of the greatest leaders of our faith. You think of David. David, a man that was after God's own heart. And then right really at the peak of his ministry, right at the peak of his reign, he has this terrible failure. Struggling with the disappointment and loss. You think of Elijah. Elijah, after calling down fire from heaven and having this wild success, what happens? He then turns and runs away into the wilderness and he wants to die. He's at his complete end. Says, I don't even know what I'm doing. He wants to stop. Think of Peter. Peter denies Jesus. Peter, in the upper room, Jesus says, you'll all deny me. And Peter says, no, I'm not gonna deny you. It won't happen. And the very thing that Peter says he won't do is the thing that he does. And it crushes him. And yet, God uses Peter in his brokenness and his failure. And not long after that, he would preach at Pentecost the sermon that starts the church. That God would use him despite his disappointment, despite his failure. Think of Paul. Paul, a murderer, a persecutor of the church that then has his life turned around. I don't know what disappointment you have in your life right now. I don't know if it's a disappointment that you've got in your marriage or your relationships or with your career, or maybe just general disappointment in life. But here's what I do know. If you want to start pursuing God's will for your life, here's the good news. You haven't missed it. There's two things that you have to do. The first is like the kindergartners. You have to start. You have to say, today is the day that I'm going to start pursuing what God has for my life. And as I start pursuing a knowledge and wisdom of God's will, that will start leading my life in the direction that God wants me to go. It will start transferring into a pursuit of holiness. That understanding God and knowing God automatically leads into a life of fruitfulness. Paul's clear on what the fruit of our life should be: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. That are those things that are coming out of my life. Now understand, my rules for success, my measurement for success is oftentimes very different than God's measurement for success. If I'm gonna find God's will, I've got to start pursuing, and then I've got to constantly be measuring, but not measuring up against my preconceived notions. Not measuring and saying, well, God, here's what I see as success. How come that's not happening? No, the marshmallow that we measure in our life is what Scripture lays out in front of us. That the effect of having a relationship with Jesus should, in fact, be fruit. It should be living a life that honors and glorifies God. There's a fascinating sermon that was preached by a guy named Henry Drummond. He was a Scottish evangelist in the 1800s. He wrote a book called The Greatest Thing in the World, and he wrote it based off of 1 Corinthians 13. The greatest of these is love. So he preached a message, he wrote a book. There's an excerpt where he talked about the fruit that should exist in your life and in my life as Christians. This is what he says: kindness, love active. Have you ever noticed how much of Christ's life was spent in doing kind things, in merely doing kind things? Run over it with that in view, and you will find that he spent a great portion of his time simply in making people happy. and doing good turns to people. There's only one thing greater than happiness in the world, and that is holiness. And it's not in our keeping, but what God has put in our power is the happiness of those about us. And that is largely to be secured by our being kind to them. The greatest thing, says someone, a man can do for his heavenly Father is to be kind to some of his other children. I wonder why it is that we are not all kinder than we are. How much the world needs it. How easily it is done. How instantaneously it acts. How infallibly it is remembered. How super abundantly it pays itself back. For there is no debtor in the world so honorable, so superbly honorable as love. Where love is, God is. He that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God. God is love. Therefore love. Without distinction, without calculation, without procrastination, love. Knowledge alone leads to a very strict and religious view of what Christianity is. When we just have a knowledge about God, but don't let that transform our life into fruit, it misses the beauty of what we're called to be. That if I have a relationship with Jesus, if I'm pursuing him and saying, God, what is your will for my life? God gives us the answer of what his will for our life is. God's answer for the will of him being done through us is that each and every day we are living a life that honors and glorifies God. That I'm pursuing an understanding of who he is. That as I open God's word, as I open my Bible, as I pray to him, I can be 100% sure that that is in fact God's will for my life. That I can be 100% sure that God's will for my life is sanctification. It's a pursuit of holiness. It's a pursuit of knowing him more and deeper. And that through that pursuit, through an understanding of who God is, the result of that should be fruit. It should be that I am living a life that looks distinctly different from the world around me. That if Christians could just get a hold of that, if the world would take note and look at our lives and say, there's something different about that person. And one of those first attributes that they use to describe you or describe me should be kindness. That there's something about them that they can just constantly be kind to everyone around them all the time. Think of the moments in your life where someone was abundantly kind to you. Maybe in moments when they didn't need to be kind to you. Those moments you remember for the rest of your life. My baby sister, her name is Beth. Her and her husband Carter, they have he's now a 5.5-year-old boy. His name is Fitzgerald. They call him Fitz. He has autism. And so he's pretty severe on the spectrum. And so he has a hard time communicating. And so they haven't done a whole lot of traveling, but about a year ago, they took a trip up to Tennessee with some friends. And on the plane ride there, Fitz doesn't like being around crowded places. It was a crowded plane. It was pre-COVID, so there's a lot of people on there. It was very noisy and loud. And so he starts scripting. Scripting means that he's saying something that he knows, something that he's memorized that doesn't necessarily apply at that moment. It doesn't fit at that moment. He's just saying it over and over and over again because it's his mechanism for dealing with the stress and anxiety that he has in that moment. And so he starts scripting and he just starts kind of yelling this thing out louder and louder. And they're trying to get him calmed down. And they're trying to get him in his seatbelt. And it just becomes this really big, embarrassing moment where the stewardess is coming over. And they kept warning them, hey, if he doesn't get calmed down, we're going to have to remove you from the flight. And so it became this really, really stressful experience. They made it, but man, it was something that they would never forget for the rest of their lives. But a week later, guess what happens? They have to get back on that same plane to go from Tennessee back to Houston. They were so nervous. They knew that he'd only flown once. This was the second time to fly. And so they knew that there's a chance and a possibility that something like this would happen again. They literally had the conversation about just buying a new car and driving home. They had the plane tickets, but they were just so nervous about what the experience would be. And so they kind of talked it through and they said, well, no, wait, he's got to learn. Let's try it one more time. And so they get onto the plane. Of course, everything about the airport is stressful. Everything about the airport, even when you've been multiple times over and over again, everything about the experience causes anxiety. And so anxiety is already high in them and in Fitz. And so they get to the airplane. They make their way to their seats. He's already kind of agitated. He's already having a hard time, and he starts to script. It's the middle of July, and he starts to sing very loudly the song Jingle Bells. Jingle Bells annoy some people in December, but in July especially, it's not exactly the song that everybody around them wants to sing. And so he starts singing pretty loudly, and they start to have that feeling of just anxiety and panic welling. And the lady that was sitting next to them, she leans over to Beth and she says, he is such a precious little boy. And then loudly, so that everybody around them and her could hear, she says, isn't it great that he's singing such a joyful song, a song like Jingle Bells? And everybody around that was a little irritated kind of started to calm down. And she just continually over the course of that plane ride just encouraged him with words of kindness. Now, that woman had no clue that on the plane ride there, that they'd had this terrible, terrible experience and almost gotten kicked off the plane. That woman had no clue what anxiety and stress they were bringing with them. But in that moment, a simple act of kindness completely transformed that moment for that family. You and I, every single day, have an incredible opportunity to do God's will. And sometimes we think that that means that we're supposed to get up on a platform or we're supposed to have huge, huge crowds. But oftentimes, what God's will means for your life and for my life means that every day I do those two simple things. I say, God, my life is yours. I'm giving you my life today, and I'm going to look with spiritual eyes to see the people around me that are in need. How can I choose to live out the gospel through action? Jesus says in John chapter 15, he says, a new commandment I give you, that you are to love your brother as I have loved you. He says, by this people will know that you are my disciples. That if we would just each day say, I'm going to live a life that is abundantly filled with kindness and love, that I stop taking my preconceived ideas of what God's will for my life is and say, okay, God, I'm just gonna take it one day at a time. I'm going to pursue you, I'm going to love you, and I'm going to look in the world around me for opportunities to love. Opportunities to be kind, opportunities to be selfless, opportunities to be humble. If that would be the defining characteristic of my life, then guess what? Without even knowing it, I step into the will of God by simply pursuing Him.